Some years ago, I was invited to the home of a fellow pastor. At that time, my daughter, Nael, was about 3 years old. While we were there, she went into the bathroom by herself. Without realizing it, she accidentally locked the door from the inside while using the toilet. When she discovered the door wouldn't open, she panicked and began to cry out. No matter how many times we tried to explain from outside how to open the door, grab the round handle, turn it to the left, and then pull towards yourself, she was far too young to understand. She didn't even know which way was left, and she didn't have the strength to turn the knob from the first place. Finally, after struggling for more than half an hour, we had to remove the doorknob from the outside in order to open the door and let her out. At that time, she didn't cry, so I thought to myself, she must have been fine after all. But afterward, she began to develop a deep fear of closed doors. Even when playing with her friends, if someone closed the door, she would suddenly burst into tears. When going with us into the laundry room, she wouldn't step in unless she stood right at the entrance, holding onto the door. When I asked her, "Niall, why don't you come inside? Why are you just standing there?" She answered, "What if the door locks again? What if I can't get out?" Fear is an inseparable part of our lives. Sometimes, like Niall, we are haunted by past experiences. At other times, unfamiliar situations we've never faced before can fill us with anxiety. In today's passage, Moses instructs Israel on what they must do when facing their enemies in battle. The text is part of the law that Moses gave Israel. In fact, in literary terms, this section is a legal document. That means what Moses sets forth here is not just good advice, it is the legal procedure Israel was required to follow before going out to war. So, what was that legal procedure? It was none other than this: remove fear. Deuteronomy 23, "Hear Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not panic or be terrified by them." So in this verse, in verse 3, we find 4 commands. Do not be faint-hearted, do not be afraid, do not panic, and do not be terrified by them. The first command, do not be faint-hearted, literally means do not let your heart grow soft. When fear grips us, our hearts lose strength and melt away. Even in Korean, we use the expression, "my heart melted away." A soft, weakened heart cannot stand against the enemy. It becomes fragile, easily wounded, and with such a weakened heart, no one can fight and expect victory. To have your heart melted is to have your foundation collapse. A house with its base eroded will crumble, even under a small gust of wind. And the third command, do not panic, literally means do not make haste. In English, we might say do not panic, and this word describes a state of losing one's peace in overwhelming fear, or, because of that state, running away in that fear. So the command is clear: do not be afraid, do not run away, but stand firm and hold your ground. Stand your ground. Do not retreat before your enemy. Do not be faint-hearted, do not be afraid, do not panic, do not be terrified. These 4 commands, Moses again and again stresses to Israel's soldiers. Do not be overcome by fear. So then, the natural question is, why does Israel feel fear when they go out to face their enemies? Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 1, "When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid of them." So the reason Israel felt fear when facing their enemies was because the enemy always had more horses, more chariots, and more soldiers. But if we stop to think about it, this is rather strange. Why was it that Israel so often had to face enemies who were bigger, stronger, and more numerous? Of course, it wasn't always the case, but much of Israel's history tells the same story. When they fled from Egypt, when they fought to conquer Canaan, when they battled surrounding nations like the Philistines or the Midianites, it was always the same. Israel had to stand like the young shepherd boy David in front of Goliath. Why would God allow such a situation? From a human perspective, if the enemy had more soldiers, more horses, and more chariots, wouldn't it make sense for God to give Israel even greater strength? More soldiers, more horses, better chariots? I mean, think of today's world. People call America a superpower because partially of its massive military budget, investing astronomical sums each year. And if having superior weapons and cutting-edge technology is what guarantees victory, why didn't God allow Israel to have the same? And it's no wonder Israel felt afraid. They were foot soldiers, and foot soldiers cannot easily stand against cavalry and chariots. Read Joshua chapter 17, verse 16. The people of Joseph replied, "The hill country is not enough for us, and all the Canaanites who live in the plain have chariots fitted with iron, both those in Bethshan and its settlements and those in the valley of Jezreel." So this is what actually happens in their history. But here's Moses' answer to this question. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 1. Do not be afraid of them, because the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, will be with you. If we translate this a bit more literally, it reads like this. Do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God is with you. He is the one who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. In other words, the very God who delivered you from Egypt, that same God is the one who is now with you. So, why does God allow his people to face stronger enemies? Because he wants Israel to know the truth that victory does not depend on the size of their army, nor on the number of horses or chariots they have. Victory depends on the Lord alone. And this is a lesson Israel must learn. Their greatest weapon is not the finest war horse, not the strongest chariot, not the most powerful army. Their true guarantee of victory is none other than the Lord their God himself. The battle may be fought by human hands, but the outcome of that battle belongs to God. In church, we often say, you cannot live today on yesterday's grace. What we mean by that is that in order to live faithfully each day, we need to experience the fresh daily outpouring of God's grace, and that is absolutely true. But the first step in experiencing today's new grace is to remember, recall, and meditate upon the grace that God has already poured out in the past. That is why the best way to overcome fear is this: remembering and meditating on the great and mighty works that God has already done for you. This is why when we come to church after living through a long week, we are comforted and strengthened. Because when we praise God, as we sing, the words remind us once again of God's greatness. And as we confess those lyrics, our hearts are renewed with the truth of who God is. Then through the word, we recall God's grace. That memory of grace makes our hearts firm again. The heart that had grown soft and faint because of fear is made strong and receives new strength. And this isn't limited to Sunday worship. Even in our daily lives throughout the week, we are strengthened through the word and through prayer, because in those moments, we are once again remembering the works of God. And when we recall and meditate upon God's past grace, we begin to realize that the God who saved and helped us yesterday is the same God who will pour out new grace upon us today. Moses says in verse 4 that the priests must declare these words to the soldiers. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory. This means we're not to stop at saying, God helped me in the past, but we must go further, and therefore he will give me victory again today. Past grace becomes the foundation of today's hope. That is why the church teaches us do not live only on past grace, because past grace must grow into today's confidence. The God who gave me victory before is the same God who will give me new victories today. He will fight for me again. He will save me again. That is the assurance we must carry. Let us now look at verses 5 through 7. The officers shall say to the army, has anyone built a new house and not yet begun to live in it? Let him go home, or he may die in battle and someone else may begin to live in it. Has anyone planted a vineyard and not begun to enjoy it? Let him go home, or he may die in battle and someone else enjoy it. Has anyone become pledged to a woman and not married her? Let him go home, or he may die in battle and someone else marry her. At first, these words may sound puzzling, because just a moment ago, Moses had said, "Don't be afraid, do not fear, do not tremble, do not be terrified, the Lord will give you victory." But now suddenly he's saying, well, if you have built a new house, planted a vineyard, or become engaged to be married, then I suppose you should go home because you might die in battle. Isn't that strange? I had to wrestle with this passage for quite some time because if we were to follow the flow of thought, shouldn't it sound more like this? You who have built a new house, are you worried that you won't be able to dedicate it? Don't be afraid. The Lord will give you victory and you will dedicate your house. You who have planted a vineyard or become engaged, do not fear. The Lord will give you victory and you will eat the fruit and you will celebrate your marriage. I mean, doesn't that seem to make more sense contextually? But instead, Moses says, you may die, so go home. At first, I thought this was just maybe what Moses is doing here is a rhetorical device, just a way of speaking. But that can't be true because, as I mentioned earlier, this passage is part of the Mosaic Law. It is a legal document. And when I looked at the commentaries, hardly anyone treated this as mere rhetoric. So I had to wrestle with this, and as I prayed and studied, I found the key in Deuteronomy chapter 28, where Moses describes the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 30. This is what Moses says, "You will be pledged to be married to a woman, but another will take her and rape her. You will build a house, but you will not live in it. You will plant a vineyard, but you will not even begin to enjoy its fruit." So here's the point. Not marrying the woman you're betrothed to, not living in the house you have built, not enjoying the vineyard you have planted, these are all signs of covenant curse, the judgment that falls upon disobedience. And that means the opposite is also true. To be able to marry the woman you are betrothed to, and to live in the house you have built, and to enjoy the fruit of your vineyard and the work of your hands, those are the covenant blessings promised by God. And when God brought Israel into Canaan, he gave them this very promise that the land would overflow with milk and honey, that they would dwell in it, multiply, and prosper from generation to generation. To build houses, to plant vineyards, marry and raise families, these were the visible signs of God's promises being fulfilled. So, in light of that, what is happening here in Deuteronomy 20 in our current passage? God is being faithful to his covenant promises. He does not command Israel to keep promises that he himself is unwilling to keep first. God always proves his faithfulness before asking for ours. He had promised his people that in the land they would experience blessing, building, planting, marrying, and thriving. And even as he calls them into battle, his desire is to fulfill that promise. And that is why he allows those who have not yet tasted those blessings to return home first, because they must experience his faithfulness for themselves. Why? Because only then will they be truly ready for battle. Only those who have personally experienced the faithfulness of God in the past in their own lives can stand in hope of his grace for today. Think of David. He did not rush into battle with Goliath out of sheer bravado. He remembered the God who had delivered him from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear. And because he had already experienced God's saving hand, he was able to stand boldly before Goliath. And it is the same here. Only those who know the God who has given them victory in the past can trust him to give victory again today. This passage was personally very striking to me. Having grown up in a faith environment where devotion and loyalty to God were always emphasized, it felt very strange to read that those who had built a house, planted a vineyard, or become engaged were told to go back home. Isn't loyalty supposed to come first? Even if you've built a house, even if you've planted a vineyard, even if you've become engaged, shouldn't devotion and faithfulness to God come before anything else? Why does Moses first say, do not be afraid, hold on to your faith, and then all of a sudden just say, go back home? It didn't make sense to me at first. But as I continued to meditate on this passage, one truth began to sink in more and more deeply. And this is this: you cannot expect loyalty from someone who has never known grace. When Israel's army stood before enemies with countless soldiers, horses, and chariots, the strength that enabled them to go forward without fear was unshakable faith in God's promises. But such faith is not something that appears out of thin air. Only those who have tasted and seen the faithfulness of God's promises can have that kind of faith. And without that experience, faith is impossible. That is why God allows His people to first experience the fulfillment of His promises. In a sense, each person must go through their own mini exodus, their own personal deliverance. Only then does the phrase, the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, become real and personal to them. Of course, this teaching can also easily be misused. Someone might think, well, I haven't yet received God's promised blessings, so I guess I can just go home. Someone else might say, okay, fine, let those who have already been blessed serve faithfully. I'll sit this one out. But we must remember that we should read this passage in the context of the whole Bible. First, if you're a child of God, and if you are indeed a genuine child of God, there is no one who can truly say, I have not received God's blessing. Because to be a child of God is the greatest blessing anyone can ever receive. There is one who bore the curse of the covenant in our place, and that is Jesus Christ, who died for us on the cross. Isaiah 53, verse 5, but He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on Him, and by His wounds we are healed. Again, Isaiah 53, verse 12, He poured out His life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors, for He bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. If Jesus was pierced for my sins, if He shed His blood for me, who among God's children can say, I have not been blessed? If He gave His life for me, and even now intercedes for me, who can dare say, I have not received anything from God? Perhaps some Israelites might have argued in Moses' day, well, those stories belong to my parents' generation, not me. I didn't experience that firsthand. But for us, who live in the New Testament age, if we truly believe the gospel of the cross, then even apart from our personal life experiences, we must look to Jesus Christ who died and rose again for us, because that is the reality for all of us. That is the guarantee of today's grace. And this is exactly what Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verse 32. He who did not spare His own Son, but gave Him up for us all, how will He not also, along with Him, graciously give us all things? Brothers and sisters, the Lord does not want us to be people who are ignorant of grace, but people who know grace, and therefore become good soldiers of Christ. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 3, Paul says, join with me in suffering, like a good soldier of Christ Jesus. So yes, God allowed those who had built a house, planted a vineyard, or became engaged to return home, but that was not because it was His ultimate delight. It was because they were not yet ready to overcome fear by faith. It was a concession on God's part to their weakness, but not a reflection of God's desire. What the Lord truly desires for us is not that we shrink back in fear, but that we move forward in bold faith. We must remember that. Finally, let us read verse 8 together, and I will leave you with one final exhortation before we end today's message. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 8. Then the officers shall add, is anyone afraid or faint-hearted? Let him go home, so that his fellow soldiers will not become disheartened too. Moses mentions one last group of people who must also return home, those who are afraid. Why? Because their fear could spread to the hearts of their brothers. Fear is like a cancer. It multiplies, it spreads, and it quickly infects those around it. So, beloved brothers and sisters, let me urge you Fill your words with words of faith. In your homes, in your church, in the way you speak to your children, let your lips be filled with faith. Do not allow fear to spill out of your mouth, dragging others down with discouragement. Instead, speak words of courage, words of hope, words of faith, words that point back to the faithfulness of our God. Just as the priest stood before Israel's army on the eve of battle and proclaimed the promises of God to strengthen their hearts, so too are you called to take up the role of spiritual priest in your homes. Proclaim faith, strengthen hearts, point your family and those around you to the God who fights for you and saves you. Let us pray.